Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. Glad to see that there are so many in the audience today. And welcome to all the ones that follow us on video or webcast. So this event is Victory over the Islamic State and U.S. Withdrawal from Syria. I'm Jonas, Parello-Plesner, a non-resident senior fellow here at Hudson. So I'm also personally glad to be back. I only now reside in Europe and only come into Washington from time to other and be here with such a stellar panel of colleagues and friends to discuss this question. So President Trump has proclaimed military victory over the Islamic State in Syria and also announced a military drawdown of U.S. troops, although a smaller U.S. military presence in the end might stay on. This has been under a lot of internal debate in the administration, and you can say there's also maybe a little bit of factual debate about is the Islamic State completely defeated, because we still have the fighting going on in a small enclave near Baghuz in Syria. What is certain is that the Islamic State's military defeat does not spell the end of the 8-year-long war in Syria. Conflict could even escalate as the U.S. withdrawal creates new uncertainties. And meanwhile, the situation inside Syria is dire. Half of the population is displaced, millions of refugees, and internally displaced persons, and a huge need of humanitarian aid. So the Syrian Democratic Forces have been sort of the backbone in liberating large swaths of territory from ISIS, and but with its main component of Syrian Kurds have been under pressure from Turkey in the north and from the Assad regime supported by Russia and Iran in the south. And so far, the U.S. military presence has been a sort of the buffer that has prevented escalation. So that's one of the sort of questions that we're going to unpack today. Another big question is that defeat of ISIS raises the question of accountability for the surviving foreign fighters and families involved. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, is holding many of these in captivity, but understandably no longer sort of willing to remain a prison. Trump tweeted 10 days back or something to Europeans to take back their nationals, but there's not a great willingness to do that. And you could say even in the U.S. case, when there was a American-born person, because both the president and Secretary of State Pompeo has sort of said that she's not a U.S. citizen, there's not a willingness to take back as well. So that means this is a really sort of big question of accountability. Who will actually make sure of prosecution? Where will these people go? And of course, it's not just fighters, there are also families, including children. So what's sort of the just solution? That's one of the other things we will address. We will also talk about how the broader war and conflict continues in Syria. Assad, stoked by Russia, might mount an armed incursion into the province of Idlib, where a sort of fragile situation exists with a region packed both with jihadists but also with refugees from the war in other provinces. Then we will also talk about how the Assad regime is starting to plan for the next phase, reconstructing Syria. A number of Arab countries seem willing to re-engage with Assad, including on reconstruction. Western countries are not willing to engage in such efforts before Assad engaged in the transition process through the United Nations. But, for example, in the European Union, some members are starting to questioning that approach. And you could say from all sides, sort of the mantra of Assad must go sounds more and more hollow. So one of my other questions that we will unpack up here is, are there any options for a negotiated solution in 2019 through the UN, Sochi, or elsewhere? So let me turn to my panel. I have a stellar panel here to help me unpack these questions. Jomana Qaddour, who is a Syrian-American analyst and doctoral candidate at Georgetown University Law Center, who has been focusing a lot on the Syrian constitution. Bassam Ishak, who is the U.S. representative for the Syrian Democratic Council, and my colleague, senior fellow Mike Doran, who has a long-standing experience in U.S. strategy for the Middle East. So I'll actually start with you, Mike, because it's been, I was about to say confusing, but maybe not, but at least it's been a little bit back and forth with the president that sort of announced now the military defeat of ISIS, and now we're withdrawing. And then there's since then been quite a sort of different opinions expressed inside and outside of the administration on this question. So there is, so I think I would like you to start there, try to explain how we understand where the U.S. is heading on Syria, how that fits into sort of the president's broader strategies, and how it fit into broader administration strategies as well on Iran and beyond what's going on in Syria. So is there still a Syria strategy in beyond destroying ISIS? So that's first over to you.
Thanks. I don't know how you could possibly be confused. It's all totally clear to me. I'll go over it anyway, even though it's all obvious. I think the starting point is the difference between President Trump's general perspective and President Obama's. President Obama was trying to. They have the same goal, I think, or they're responding to the same political imperative in the United States, which is to kind of keep the Middle East at arm's length. And not to get involved in more deeply in wars in the region, but they have very different ways of going about it. President Obama was trying to create a kind of a concert system with the Iranians and the Russians, a round table that we all sit around and come up with solutions to problems like Syria. And the assumption of that approach is that the U.S., Russia, Iran, and the other major players in the region all have an interest in defeating ISIS. The problem was that approach couldn't actually generate the forces needed to defeat ISIS militarily, so we had to put together the counter-ISIS strategy. Trump came in, and he wants to isolate Iran, but he also promised to defeat ISIS. I mean, his promise in the campaign was, quote, to bomb the shit out of ISIS. On the counter-ISIS strategy, he kept the Obama strategy and put it on. I ramped it up, actually. But in the larger regional strategy, he wants to pull the United States back and then work through traditional allies, which means Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia against Iran. And then there soon developed a contradiction here, because the Obama approach, the counter-ISIS strategy that was followed by the Obama people, which carried on into the Trump administration, was a tacitly pro-Iranian strategy. You see that if you listen to Brett McGurk, who was responsible for the counter-ISIS strategy. If you listen to what he's been saying since he resigned in protest over Trump's decision to pull the troops out, he's saying, well, what we need to do is we need to broker a deal with the Assad regime, that is the client of Russia and Iran, to bring the SDF and the Kurds, the Syrian Kurds, up under the regime, and the enemy in his eye is Turkey. That's a completely unacceptable vision to the Trump administration, because Trump wants to. Trump is interested in finding a strategic accommodation with Turkey. Of course, it was in a conversation with President Erdogan that made Trump finally get frustrated with his counter-ISIS bureaucracy and military, and said, "No, we're pulling out." The problem was that the counter-ISIS people were not just destroying ISIS in a way that was acceptable to the Russians and the Iranians. They were also using the Syrian Kurds, helping the Syrian Kurds to build Rojava. That's an independent Kurdish statelet in Syria, run by the YPG, which is the Syrian offshoot of the PKK, the separatist Kurds of Turkey. So we were building a Kurdish separatist state in Syria that was going to threaten the integrity of Turkey, and then push Turkey into the arms of the Russians. So President Trump said, no, that's not acceptable, pull the troops out. The minute he did that, though, surprisingly, he got a call from President Erdogan, or a message from President Erdogan saying, not so fast, don't run away. Because and he also got calls from the Israelis and the Saudis and others and said, hey, those troops that you've got in Syria, they're blocking the Iranian land bridge. So now there's a sort of a rethink going on, and the idea is to keep the number that I keep hearing thrown around is 200 American soldiers in the north, 200 down in Tanf. That's the little base just off, over the Jordanian border in Syria, which is an important place for the Iranian land bridge to proceed to block the Iranian land bridge. Just as we were talking beforehand, Jomana said she's hearing other numbers that are being thrown around about the number of troops to be left in there. The key thing is that the Americans recognize there's two factors here. One is that they want the Europeans to come in and to help them with this project, and they can't do that without having some Americans there. And also, they don't want to lose influence over the YPG and the Syrian Kurds. And the Turks don't want them to lose influence either, because if they lose complete influence, the YPG will migrate to the Russians and the Iranians, and that will be a problem. So U.S. policy is trying to thread this needle, block the Iranians on the ground, maintain some influence with the YPG, keep it from becoming a Russian Iranian proxy, but also keep President Erdogan happy. This is a hard needle to thread.
You make it sound so sensible that you could become senior director again. Will this work out?
Will it work out? Of course it will work out. You know, the beauty is that we are the United States of America, separated from all of this by oceans, you know? So for us, it always works out. The question is, will it work out for anybody on the ground there? And that's a much harder question. Look, there's no one can say whether anything in Syria is going to work out. It's going to be a very difficult problem until you and I die, I think. But I think that the conception that the Trump people have makes as good a sense of is as sensible a way to proceed here as is possible, because the key issue is Turkey. This is in my view. Because Turkey is the key to the refugee issue that the Europeans are concerned about. It's the key to stabilizing Syria in the end. Turkey has the second largest military or maybe the largest military in NATO. You could tell me, is it the largest? It's the largest.
Well, the U.S. is in NATO still.
Yeah. No, I mean among the European powers. The second largest in NATO. That's why I had that in my head. The second largest in NATO. It's the gateway to the Middle East. This Kurdish question in Syria is existential for the Turkish Republic. There's no way that they are going to let a Syrian separatist state be built there. So the concerns that the Trump administration has and the way it's trying to go about it are very sensible.
Thanks, Mike. I would now turn to Bassam Ishak, and would love to hear your thoughts, particularly from the region, from Syria, and from a perspective from the SDF as well, on what's likely to happen in the northeast of Syria. How will the U.S. military withdrawal in different forms, if it's a full withdrawal or if it's with some residual force, how will that affect what's likely to happen, and how you see this evolve?
Thank you. Thank you, Mike, for this overview from the strategic point of view. It's interesting for me as a local Syrian, to hear this, because we don't hear it often. It's how do we feel as locals from North Syria, as indigenous people of Syria, about this struggle and this jockeying for power and for authority by all these actors. For us, we didn't have all these calculations, of course. At first, all we wanted to do is to survive ISIS. This is what it was for us. For example, I used to be with the Syrian National Council. I switched to the Syrian Democratic Council because this is where we could work for survival physically as groups. For example, I'm from northeast of Syria, and I'm Syriac. So how do we, as Syriacs and other communities, survive in the midst of this jockeying between all these powers? This is what it was for us, survival. And then as we were able to fill the vacuum of the withdrawal of the Assad forces from our region, east of the Euphrates, then it was a question, well, how are we going to run this? What is it that we want? How we want to live together as diverse groups, whether ethnically diverse, Kurds, Arabs, and Syriacs, or whether religiously diverse, Muslims and Christians. So that was the question, and the way we overcome it was through negotiation among ourselves, locals, that came up and produced a social contract that had a vision. And this vision was, we wanted to live in a pluralistic model, and we wanted to live in a model that there is a power sharing between all the ethnic groups or religious groups, a model that has gender equality, where women will be equal to men, and also a model that guarantees religious freedom. Why religious freedom? Because religious identity has been a tool in Syria and other Arab countries to oppress and to rule. We wanted actually to spare religion from abuse by politicians. That was the model that we came up with. We're not against religion. We wanted to spare the Syrians from abuse of religion. So this model is quite different from the model of Assad, for example, who is being promoted, the Ba'ath Party, as being protector of the minorities and of the Christians. Because this is not just giving you freedom to worship and keep an identity that you inherited from your father and mother, your parents. It's a model that gives you the free choice to choose your religion or even to be non-believer in any religion. So this was the uniqueness. We felt that this will be the way to put the train on the way to democracy. We felt that democracy doesn't start by rushing into the voting booth, where we all know the voting booth is the majority rules. We wanted first, before the majority rules, to do two things. One, to say that first for New Syria should be human rights and the rights of individuals and rights of groups, because Syria is very diverse. This is where it should start. And the other thing we said is rule of majority should be based on political majority, not a sectarian or religious majority. This was what our project about. It was not about a Kurdish state. It was not about separating from Syria, but starting a model for the rest of Syria. Now, Turkey didn't see it this way, and others don't see it this way. This is, as individuals, citizens, this is how we experience it. This is how we see it. So now, whatever we have done later politically, whether when we came into alliance with the US, we didn't start with an alliance with the US at first. We just filled the vacuum. But then when we came into an alliance, we had to be playing this within this jockeying for power. Yes, of course, Turkey looked at us mainly as a Kurdish threat, and it has 20 million Kurds, and what would the Kurdish model, in their mind, mean to Turkey internally? This is not our project. Our project is for all Syrians. In the Syrian Democratic Councils, we have Arabs, we have Syriacs, we have Assyrians, and we have Kurds as well. Yes, the Kurds are taking a pioneer role at this time, is because they contribute the most ideologically to the social contract, the idea of pluralism, religious freedom, and also women gender equality. And also on the fighting battle on the ground, they are experienced fighters and leaders. But the project, as it stands, as is practiced in our areas, is not about a Kurdish state, and it's not about separation from Syria. The very opposite. So what happens if the U.S., back to your question, what happens if the U.S. withdraw to this project? It's actually how the U.S. withdraws. If it's a sudden withdrawal and full withdrawal, that means there will be a vacuum in east of the Euphrates, in 1/3 of Syria. And who will come in and fill this vacuum? Well, Iran and Turkey, they're both, want to fill this vacuum. Assad regime and Russia, of course, they would like to fill this vacuum. Iran is already working in east of the Euphrates on buying of tribal leaders among the Arabs. Turkey also is working, trying to buy off people. So the fight against ISIS does not end with a military victory. It's really what happens next after the military victory. ISIS has ruled now for 5 years in east of the Euphrates, and it has big number of sleeping cells. We know this because we have about 109 people of SDC who were assassinated in the last year. It hasn't made the media, but this is a challenge that we need to overcome to have stability. And I think stability is the key for the future. If we are able to continue to fill the vacuum, and if the American withdrawal is planned and is in coordination with us, then I think we will be able to manage to have a stability, which we think it will be the second stage of the fight against ISIS. And the third stage, after overcoming the sleeping cell, should be really overcoming the ideology and culture of ISIS, so we could eventually arrive at a stable Syria.
That would be good. When you mentioned sort of that it all started with democracy rather than, do you have aspirations that some of this could be transferred to the whole of Syria? When you also said this is not about breaking up Syria, I mean, there is the whole UN-led process also on transition that, but where the SDF classically has not been represented. But how do you see?
So we haven't been represented. We've been marginalized. And according to everybody we've talked to who is involved, of the states who are involved in putting together the Geneva talks and the Constitution Committee, Turkey is the party that objects to our presence. And that's natural. This is where they feel the most threat coming from our model, and because they misunderstand our model, or they want to misunderstand it. It's one of the two options. But in either case, if we are not included at the table, you have not included a different vision than the regime or the opposition. So Turkey is only allowing the opposition that is okay with its vision for Syria, not our vision as Syrian people, to be at the table. This will not lead to a political solution that we will go along with in 1/3 of the country and 2/3 of Syria's economy. We will not go with such a solution. And it will not be a solution that is sustainable, that will produce really stability long-term in Syria. And it will mean really a phantom of a solution. We will resist it, and it will mean a reigniting war in Syria.
I also wanted to ask you about the post-conflict stabilization that has been happening in the northeast and in the areas. For example, Raqqa, which is, of course, is symbolically important as capital of ISIS sort of terror regime. where demining and where the sort of the anti-ISIS coalition has been working, the U.S. but also other European partners and others. How you see that in connection with the U.S. sort of withdrawal, if this effort will be undermined by that or can be carried forward?
Of course, when you have a void and you have a bigger, more powerful army marching into our region, then the logistics of the minings and other will have to stop and wait and resume when there is a possibility of resumption. And it will mean, a delay, a long delay, in really overcoming ISIS that is not military ISIS. This is so it's who can really win the fight after winning the military fight. We believe that we who are indigenous, who had the incentive and were the only willing party to fight ISIS militarily, are best equipped and have incentive to fight ISIS, whether on the other fronts, whether it's the sleeping cells or the cultural fight.
Thanks. We have a lot of big questions. I'll now turn to Jomana as well to talk about, as I mentioned in the introduction, both about accountability, the military defeat of ISIS, begs the question, what is going to happen with the remaining foreign fighters that haven't been killed and fight their families, their children? So what kind of accountability, and also for people in the region that have suffered enormously? And then the second question that I also mentioned in the intro was the question of reconstruction, where the Assad regime now is seeking to translate the military gains on the ground in starting reconstructing Syria, and is having a little bit of headway with having Arab state recognized or re-engage with Assad. So I wanted you also to talk about this and how you see reconstruction.
Sure. Thank you, Jonas, for having me on this panel. I'll start off by addressing probably the hottest topic, which is the returning, or the prospect of returning ISIS fighters back to their home country. So this was sort of spurred by President Donald Trump's tweet on February 16th, where he basically told our European allies, France, Germany, and Britain, to come and take their ISIS fighters back home and to prosecute them, or otherwise that we were going to have to release them. So this started a big debate, obviously, on social media and beyond. And it's important sort of just to lay out the figures. So if we estimate that there had been about 80 to 100,000 ISIS fighters total, about 40,000 of them were foreign, which is a large number, from 110 different countries. Now, a lot of those have been killed, or they've disappeared. We don't necessarily, I'm sure the appropriate authorities are probably tracking different people, but the majority of them have not returned. There's maybe about only 5,000 that have actually returned to about 33 countries. Now remember, ISIS fighters came from all over the globe. Like I said, 110 countries. You had 8,700 from the former Soviet Union and Russia. You had 5,700 from the EU. That includes almost 2,000 from France and 850 from the UK. You had 3,000 each from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from Tunisia. And now a lot of these countries are trying to figure out what to do with the ones that are going back. Now, at the outset, I should say, no country is excited about taking back any of these ISIS fighters. So even though this debate is waging on, all governments are incredibly hesitant. Even the French government, which I think has taken sort of the most direct approach, which is anyone who was captured by the SDF and they're in Syria, we're taking them back. Those in Iraq are going to be prosecuted by the Iraqi system, which has its many problems, which I don't know if I'll have a chance to go into here. But the ones in Syria are going back. Now, the British, overall, they do have a law called the British Nationality Act, which permits their Secretary of State to deprive someone of citizenship for their affiliation that might be prejudicial to Britain, including their involvement with a terrorist organization. But they can only do this if the person would not be rendered stateless. And so in most situations, the ISIS fighters that they have in Syria, they technically cannot deprive him or her of citizenship. Now, it's come down to Shamima, I believe that's how, Shamima Begum's case, because they're claiming that her mother, who had Bangladeshi citizenship, that she would be eligible for that. And so that's, and the other problem with this particular woman is that she also was in a very well-publicized television interview where she stated very directly that she did not regret having joined ISIS. So this spurred a whole debate in Britain where it's like, why do we have to take this woman who is not only eligible potentially for citizenship elsewhere, but she's not even regretful for what she's done. Now, whether or not these individuals are regretful, because in the American case we have one who is regretful, I think that shouldn't necessarily factor into the discussion. I think the critical part is if these people are citizens of any particular country. I think that, and this is also what I've gathered from a lot of my discussions with people in the region, both in Syria and Iraq, that people should be sent back home to their countries to be prosecuted and monitored very carefully, which I know is obviously a security risk, but letting them loose in Syria will still pose a security threat, I think a global security threat, because the Syrian authorities also do not have the capability and probably not even the willingness to track these ISIS fighters, which they probably would be more than happy to have running around. In terms of, with the United States, you had about 129 foreign fighters who left. 7 of them have returned. The overwhelming majority, from what we understand, will be brought back and prosecuted. I mean, the ones that are captured. But the problematic one is Huda Muthanna, and the reason there's such a controversy around her is because her father was a Yemeni diplomat at the time that she was born here in the United States. Now, technically, obviously, people who are born in the United States are afforded birthright citizenship according to the 14th Amendment. But there's a technicality here which Secretary of State Pompeo did not say directly, but he did say that she wouldn't be allowed. She's not technically a citizen. But the legal sort of battle that's going on here in the background is whether or not she was born before her father left his duties at the Yemeni embassy and resigned from his post. Now, she was born in October, and her father technically left his post in June. So I know that there was a New York Times article that talked about this, and this is currently a legal battle that's going to continue to play out. I just wanted to mention briefly about the ones, so the children, Jonas and I were talking about this. The children of ISIS fighters, technically, countries haven't said that they're not going to take any of them, but as I said, similar to both the men and the women that joined ISIS, there's no like enthusiasm to take back any of these children, even if it means delivering them back to their extended families. And about Iraq, I just wanted to mention, although I know their scenario is differently, because most nations have, relationships with the Iraqi government, technically they can be prosecuted by the Iraqi government, who's shown willingness to do so. Now, the problem is the Iraqi law on this is very, it's quite archaic. I mean, there's the 2005 anti-terrorism law basically prosecutes people solely based on membership or providing any material support. So that means someone who raped a Yazidi woman would be prosecuted exactly the same way as someone who might have given an ISIS fighter a cup of sugar. There's no really gray areas in the Iraqi law, and this is and the other problem is that the only way they deal with with ISIS fighters is death by punishment or life imprisonment if they can show some mitigating factors. And so this is an enormous task, even for the most, I think, the most evolved of countries and the most stable of countries. So you're talking about tens of thousands potentially ISIS fighters that Iraq would have to deal with under this system, which is problematic. A UN Security Council resolution was passed in 2017, Resolution 2379, that was meant to help professionalize the Iraqi law, but it's still sort of in the beginning stages, and we're far from where we need to be. About reconstruction, and I actually just published a piece on this yesterday about reconstruction in Syria. Now, as my co-panelists said, that Iran and Russia may have won sort of the military phase of the battle in Syria, but unfortunately they have not won the peace, and they will not be able to win the peace if Syria stays as is. There is severe disruption in Syrian society, a lot of unknowns. It still remains a security state, heavily security state, and it's simply, I mean, there's many reports out there in the past month that have been released about Syrians who have tried to make their way back to Syria. from neighboring countries and even a few from Europe that have been detained or disappeared immediately upon arriving, even when they have checked beforehand to see if they are on any security list or any wanted list. But to go briefly into the specifics of Syrian reconstruction. So according to Syria's own Central Bureau of Statistics, the GDP has shrunk by 80% between 2010 to 2016. The World Bank estimates that the public revenue, so the public funds, have dropped from 23% to 3% between 2010 and 2015. And the lira is inflated by 459%. This is due for a lot of reasons. Remember, the Syrian government has lost access to oil revenues. There's been a trade collapse due to sanctions. There's been robust informal economy as opposed to formal economy, informal economy as opposed to formal economy. And there's been a lack of local capacity to collect any taxes. UN ESCWA estimates that the damage is in total of about $400 billion. And 65% of that is solely to the infrastructure and the housing. So a great portion of that is due to housing loss. You have the Europeans and the Americans both that have placed about 270 individuals and as well as 72 entities that are closely related to the regime on their sanctions list, including Rami Makhlouf, Samir Foz, Mohammed Hamsho. You know, and the problem that we're hearing, you know, there's this talk of reconstruction from Syria, and from its allies. And unfortunately, the fantastical images that are coming out of Syria are these beautiful sort of Disneyland type of, you know, buildings and entertainment centers that are being proposed. These the apartments, for example, that are being built in this area in, like, for example, Marota City or El Qaboon, these are buildings that have apartments that cost about $500,000. I mean, they are beyond the reach of the average Syrian, let alone any returning refugee. What I'm trying to really paint the picture of here is that we are not talking about the reconstruction of Syrian society or rebuilding of Syrian society so that it can accommodate for the average war-ravaged Syrian. We're talking about a Syria that is meant to enrich an already corrupt and intransparent class of people who are very close to Bashar al-Assad and his oligarchy. And this is not to mention even the variety of laws that have been, there's about 20 laws that actually the Syrian regime has passed since the beginning of the conflict that are intended really to dispossess as many Syrians as possible from their property. So you have the very famous controversial Law 10, that is meant to, that forces Syrians to register their property within a year. And keep in mind that even prior to the war, only about 50% of Syria's land was actually properly registered. So that leaves already 50% of people out of luck. You had Law 3 that allows now governors to demolish private buildings on land, and the legislative decree number 63, which is sort of their counterterrorism law, which allows for dispossession of anybody that the Syrian regime considers a terrorist from their property. Of course, this is all done without due process. So this is another way of dispossessing property. Now, the problem is that about 2 weeks ago, Bashar al-Assad spoke in front of parliament, claiming that the majority of the people outside of the country that are Syrian, they do not care about Syria, they don't care about the welfare of Syria, and therefore that is why they are supporting sanctions on Syria. Now, what unfortunately Bashar al-Assad failed to mention is the fact that he has pretty much contracted away almost all of Syria's resources. You have the kind of support that Iran has offered to the Syrian regime since 2013 has been $6 to $7 billion worth of crude oil in loans. That is not a grant. That is money that the Iranian regime is expecting the Syrian government to pay it back. In addition, the Russians have invested $1.2 billion a year on their military forces in Syria. And while that was to support their military efforts, they have gotten the regime to contract away and monopolize all the phosphate production of Syria for the next 50 years. They have also done and signed a variety of deals to liberate, defend, and develop the oil and gas fields, including in northeastern Syria. So this is something that, in terms of opening this door, that what Iran and Russia are basically waiting to see now is who is going to invest in Syria so that they can start getting their profits on the investment that they have made by providing these loans to the Assad regime. They are not actually capable or willing to offer right now at this very moment any cash to the Syrian regime. Both the Russians and the Iranians, due to a variety of sanctions, are cash-strapped themselves, so they're unable to provide that support. Now, neighboring countries, you mentioned the Arab countries that opened up their embassies, or some who already had embassies opened up actually before, but that made it more public. Now, the Egyptians, yes, they have invited Ali Mamlouk, but they don't have the capacity or the ability to invest in Syria right now. The Jordanians and the Lebanese have, I mean, they're also not capable of investing, but the kind of trade that's happening right now due to opening of borders, specifically the Nasib crossing, is not the kind of trading that is going to actually rebuild Syria. We're talking about more like lower level trade. And even prior to the war, the Lebanese and Jordanian economy, maybe only 4% of their GDP actually depended on formal trade, depended on their trade with Syria. So this isn't going to, take Syria from the rubble it's in now to, a paradise of any sort. Now, the Gulf countries are a different situation. However, I believe Secretary Pompeo's trip to the region really put pressure on the Gulf countries not to move forward with their plans to potentially invest. In fact, the trade meeting that was held in Abu Dhabi, you saw quickly that lower level members from the UAE side were asked to attend, not anyone really significant, and it was meant to be a private sort of exchange and not a government exchange. So I think for right now, we are not going to see the Gulf move on this until further notice and in cooperation with the Americans. Now, to my final sort of conclusion on this, in terms of what the U.S. position is. Now, what we've seen, the three major hallmarks, building off of what Mike said, in terms of the U.S. position, goes back to pushing back on Iranian hegemony, destroying the Islamic State, but also conditioning real reconstruction on real political process according to UN Resolution 2254. Now, I understand that as someone who is a Syrian-American, I think it's important to realize I work a lot with people on the ground. I'm not oblivious to the conditions of the people inside of Syria and what our sanctions have done, what they continue to do, what they will do in the future. But I think the international community, we have failed to stop the killing of 1 million people, the displacement of 13 million others. But I think we're at a very critical juncture right now if we are not going to, I don't think there's a way to really restore justice in this situation fully. Too much blood has been shed. But there are measures we can take, because Bashar al-Assad is 53 years old. He has potentially a very long time in office left. And I think the minimal thing that the international community and both the United States and our partners can try to work on is to make it as difficult as possible for this type of regime to continue in the fashion and the manner that it is operating inside of Syria. Now, I know that's a very daunting task, but I do believe that the regime does need the rest of the international community to actually fund this reconstruction. Its allies are not able to do it. And so there is some leverage that I think can be placed, or at least we should really sincerely attempt to use that leverage at this point in time. And that's things like looking for ending conscription. You have a mass exodus, all the young men of Syria. Recently a law was released that bans any company from hiring any Syrian who did not serve in the military. So even if you have Syrian men who did not flee or become refugees in the course of this war, they now are fleeing. I've met with some of them who are just now fleeing Syria after, the 8-year war, because they are being demanded to go to the military and are not finding any way, even being able to pay off their way out of military service. The Constitutional Committee, I understand there's a lot of skepticism about that. This morning, I think Peterson was quoted saying, or was it yesterday, that at least it would be an attempt at an actual dialogue between the opposition and the regime, different Syrians from both sides, that is yet to happen, I think, at a national scale. The elections, of course, given if they were to comply with with safety, etc. Distancing sanctioned regime figures from actually these reconstruction projects that the regime is trying to benefit from, refraining from intervention with international humanitarian organizations, including the United Nations, which has been attacked itself by regime forces. And then you have the detainees, including American detainees. Austin Tice is one of them, Majid Kamalmaz, and the release of them. But there's also 100,000 Syrians who remain in Assad's prisons as political prisoners. And I think that that is something that both the UN envoy Peterson is pressing, but that the United States should continue to press on. So I'll stop there. I've said enough. Sorry.
Thank you. No, thanks a lot, Jomana. This was fascinating. But I would actually want to test you a little bit on the last question again, and like how much political leverage there really is in reconstruction, in the sense that what we've not been willing, the US and Western partners, to do on the battlefield, can that be won back sort of as political leverage? Also with a guy like Assad, who's been willing to slaughter his own population for 8 years, will he then, for reconstruction money, actually really give up and engage in a transition process that could lead to his own ouster? I just want your sort of realistic assessment of that.
Yes. I mean, listen, I don't think it's going to be easy to get Assad to concede to anything. He obviously hasn't yet. But he does have partners and allies who do want to push forward. Russia has been very adamant about trying to push forward. My understanding is that they are looking for things that they might be able to get him to concede on, so that they could also get the West to concede on some of this. And I think it's important to realize that there's also gradients. I mean, reconstruction, there's, Rami Makhlouf's idea of reconstruction, which is these, like I said, fantastical buildings in the suburbs of Damascus. But there's also these issues of humanitarian plus for aid, that actually for people that are truly deserving of humanitarian aid, have been starved by the regime, are living in poverty-stricken areas, but happen to live in regime-held areas. And so I think that there's different ways that we might be able to get concessions, most likely through Assad's partners, not necessarily through him directly. But as I said, what he's overseeing is really, I think, a dead carcass at this point. I mean, if 80% of the GDP is gone, and the United States continues to put leverage on and pressure on other allies, and remember, the region also needs stability. I mean, even our allies in the region, be it Israel, Turkey, the Gulf, etc., Jordan, I mean, they are also looking for a way to stabilize this region. This kind of chaos is not beneficial for any one of our allies. And so I think there might be some way to form some consensus. I don't look at this as us being able to achieve our maximalist demands. And I don't think Assad will give in on all of these demands. But I do think there must be a true attempt at trying to extract as many concessions as possible. And that may mean that we don't necessarily give absolutely all the reconstruction aid necessary. But there might be some gradients we might be able to work with, so that it's not a black and white scenario.
Thanks. Bassam, I wanted you, on the other point that Jomana addressed, the question of accountability for ISIS fighters, and also because since a lot of these fighters and families are held in the region, and particularly in the northeast in SDF areas, I wanted your thoughts on that, and also on local accountability. As you were saying in your own case, from your own experience, it was about survival, as you said at first. So of course, during 5 years of sort of ISIS, of what is sort of your thoughts on the just solution?
Well, the ISIS fighters are the big problem for us, is how we can't, as a force, the SDF, cannot continue to just house these people forever, And we are doing it with our own means, with no help from anybody. So, of course, the best solution for us is that their original country will take them back, but they are finding excuses not to do that. So then we need to have a dialogue with these countries. We have to have a solution. They can't just ignore us and say, you keep these people and it's not our problem. It is everybody's problem. These people are dangerous to the national security of much of these countries, that these people came from. They need to be partner with us not just in fighting ISIS, but also in the problems that have arisen from fighting ISIS. So whether it will be an option of, if they don't want to take them and have them in court, there we have to agree on a place to have a court for them, on the procedures, how to deal with them. This needs a serious dialogue. It just cannot be ignored.
I agree on that. Mike, you said before we started that you like to go last, so you started first, but now you sort of get to go last here in this round. So I both wanted you, after hearing these sort of different, how that you laid out sort of how to make sense of the Trump strategy on Syria. But if I turn the question around and say, sort of then what worries you most for 2019 on evolutions in Syria, and any of your thoughts on what our other panelists have added to the debate? Well,
my worry is always Iran. It's Iran.
I somehow knew that.
Yeah. I think that the job of the United States in the Middle East is to contain Iran. I would say to contain Iran and Russia, but the Russian power in the region is built on an Iranian base. So if you take care of Iran, then you're also taking care of Russia. And the American strategy, the Trump strategy on Iran, it's a coercion strategy, but the tools that the United States is using are primarily economic. And Iran continues to gobble up territory on the ground. It's interesting for me to hear Bassam saying that the Iranians are now buying off tribes in northeast Syria. That, of course, makes sense to me. So my number one concern is that we don't effectively block Iran on the ground. My number two concern is the whole problem of accommodating Turkey. I mean, I don't think that stabilization of Syria is possible without bringing in the Turks. I don't think that, but it's very difficult to broker an agreement between the Kurds and the SDF with the Turks without significant force on the ground, which we no longer have. So that's the real serious diplomatic challenge. On the question of reconstruction, I'm a little bit more hardline than Jomana on that. I don't think a dime of, I mean, you can hear from the way in Jomana's excellent analysis of how the Assad regime is working with the Russians and the Iranians. The Russians and the Iranians are salivating at the thought that European money will start flowing into Turkey because it's going to flow to the Russians and the Iranians. So the challenge there is how do we look after our interests, do some good in Syria, and not enrich and empower the Russians and the Iranians and the regime. And that's a very difficult needle to thread as well. I mean, my first, if any money is going to go into Syria, I think it has to go to the northeast and not to the. You like that? Yeah, I have an ally here with Bassam. That's where, and it should be used strategically as a tool to broker an understanding, to further the possibility of an understanding, an accommodation between the Turks and the Kurds and the SDF. That's where I would put my first any first efforts about reconstruction. As far as the regime is concerned, I think we have to put a boot on Assad's neck and leave it there for as long as possible.
And how do you do that, the boot?
Well, I mean, it's economically, right? I think that we should, I mean, part of our policy against the, you know what? I'll tell you what. After this, you can take all the, I'm beautiful, you can take all the pictures you want of me. I'll give you nude photos. but you're getting in the way of my thought patterns here. So you see now I even lost
Assad, a boot on the neck.
Yeah, a boot on the neck of naked Assad. No, the strategy against the Iranians is to deprive them of money. That's the heart and soul of the American strategy. And so, letting money flow into Syria so it can go into their pockets, that's not going to help at all.
I'll let any of the two of you, if you want to comment. Meanwhile, I'll also open up gradually for questions. So put up your hands, and I'll Jomana or Bassam, if you want to comment on any of this, then I'll start collecting a lot of people that want to ask. Okay, so let's start down here with a question down here.
Thank you. Michael Kurtzig, retired from USDA, having worked in the Middle East. Thank you very much, Jomana, for an excellent discussion here. About 8 or 9 months ago, former Minister of Defense Victor Lieberman spoke to us in the Near East Policy Institute and said that Israel will do everything to stop Iran from having bases in Syria under any circumstances. And there is a steady war going on. Number one, does the withdrawal of U.S. troops mean escalation between Israel and Iran and the Syrians? Does that mean that war will heat up even more? And second of all, Jomana, asking you, I worked on agriculture. What is agriculture doing over there? What is the infrastructure situation? The bridges must be all gone. The roads must be destroyed. We see pictures over here, which are horrible. What is the port situation? How's the average person living? What are they doing for that? And thank you again for your discussion.
Thanks. Excellent questions. Mike, I know you said you don't talk most about Iran, but you also like to talk about Israel. So I think that first question, and then on to Jomana.
Yes, absolutely. There's going to be an escalation. It's already begun between the Israelis and the Iranians. And this complex relationship between the Israelis and the Moscow and the Iranians is also developing. Prime Minister Netanyahu has just come back from another trip to Moscow, and the reports say that the Russians and the Israelis are going to put together a joint committee to look into the elimination of foreign fighters in Syria. The Israelis have been very effective by their own evaluation at damaging the Iranian position. It's not clear to me, though, that operating purely from the air as they do can achieve the goals that they have set for themselves. Part of their strategy is to put pressure on the Russians by demonstrating to the Russians that they can damage things that the Russians hold dear, and in particular, they can threaten the very stability of the Assad regime. But the challenge there, or the problem with that strategy, is that it's kind of a nuclear option. The Iranians are working piecemeal, and as the Israelis proved effective at stymieing them in Syria, now they're moving over to Iraq, and they're putting in capabilities in Iraq to be able to hit Israel from Iraq. So now, are the Israelis going to be attacking in Iraq, where we still have American forces and so on? So the Iranians have shown. I mean, the Israelis have shown the Iranians to be vulnerable. They've shown them to be incapable of. The Iranian deterrence has been shown to be ineffective, but the Iranians are they have learned from the experience, and they're trying to come up with new strategies for dealing with it. So I think it's going to be a long-term fight. That's why the Israelis were very concerned about the United States pulling precipitously out of Syria.
Jomana, reconstruction, yes. Agriculture.
Yeah, just real quick. So in terms of agriculture, you have, so in Raqqa, which is a place where we still are, there are a couple of institutions that have been focusing on the agricultural production. There's the Syria Recovery Trust Fund, which I know a lot of the Gulf states are involved in. They've been investing heavily in maintaining some of the agricultural production, and that's largely that is outside of Assad control. So that's the agriculture as it looks like from there. Now, in other parts of Syria, I myself actually have a humanitarian nonprofit in Idlib. I co-founded one. We still work in Idlib, which conditions are completely different than the rest of Syria. And although HTS dominates there, the one saving grace is that they are not capable, nor do they have the funding to maintain the medical work. So our medical work is untouched, as with other medical work in Idlib. Outside of medical work, however, they do dominate the scene, and it's been very difficult for other entities to work. Now, in the rest of Syria, I think you'll find a severe struggle to find employment. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles they have. And as I said, when there's been such a brain drain in Syria, I've been trying to find the newest statistics. Now, obviously, that would have to be verified in some way. And so I haven't seen any new statistics from the last 2 years, actually, on the state of the professionals and their existence still inside of Syria. But by all measures and all the World Bank reports that I've read, is that in Daraa you may see some attempt at trying to revitalize the agriculture there, but without really the critical, as you said, the infrastructure that has been bombed and the money necessary to rebuild it. I can't see that beyond, sort of on a very small scale. I don't see that going anywhere near what Syria needs at the moment. And like I said, the Jordanian and Lebanese trade, it's began, but it's very small scale. Like you've seen trucks going in and out of Syria to Lebanon and Jordan, but it's not going to revitalize the Syrian economy. So
we have a question over here, and follow this gentleman's example of just stating your name, affiliation, and ask a question, maximum 2, not a long commentary. Thanks, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Lauren Homer. My question really is for Mike about Turkey. I understand what you're saying, that is the view of the Trump administration, but Turkey's role in Syria has been to back ISIS in a not entirely secretive way. It's backing jihadis in Idlib. It's invaded Afrin with, genocide, war crimes that are ongoing to this day, as the UN reported just yesterday or the day before. And what they want to do with the Northeast, they want to bring in 2.5 million refugees. Well, there are 3 million people living there now. So obviously they want to cleanse the area just like they did in Afrin. So I guess my question is, how can we really see Turkey as a partner to stabilize Syria, except to tell them they can't keep doing this? And then just one real quick question for Joanna. There's well-established U.S. law that if you pledge allegiance to a foreign power that's antagonistic to the United States, you can lose your citizenship. So I'm wondering how that factors in. Thanks.
Thank you. Very good questions. Turkey, is that the wrong bet for the U.S.?
No, it's not the wrong bet, because I think there are 2 points you have to start from, and one is the United States is not going to put large numbers of troops on the ground in the Middle East. It's not going to do that. And we've seen 2 elections, Obama and Trump, both presidents promising they're not going to do that and getting a lot of electoral support on both sides of the aisle. And if you follow the debate in Congress, you can see that on the left and on the right, there's no appetite for this. So that then leads to an inevitable consequence. We either work with proxies or we don't do anything at all. And so when you start looking at proxies that can help, you don't have a large number, especially if a priority, which I completely agree with, is to counter the Iranians and the Russians. Turkey's a factor. It's a huge country. It's not like Iraq and Syria, Jordan, countries that don't have a long history. Has a long history, has a deep understanding of what its place in the world is, and it's going to make its interests felt, whether we like it or not. So the question, the only possibility for us is to work with it, To say that we're going to shut it out, how are we going to shut it out? They live there. They have a border there. They have the second most powerful military in NATO. The first most powerful military in NATO is not available for operation in this area. So the strategy that we were following from the beginning was unbelievably misguided because it was guaranteed to alienate the Turks. And all of the things that they've been doing around the region that are frustrating to us, which includes some of the things that you mentioned, I wouldn't put them quite the way you did, are understandable to me on the basis of the affront that they receive from us. Is that by the year 2043, 1/3 of the population of Turkey is going to be Kurdish. And we were building a Kurdish separatist state. I disagree with Bassam on this side. We were giving Kurdish separatists the capacity to build a Kurdish separatist state on their border, and this is like building up Hamas in Jordan. And when the Israelis say, you know, this is going to affect the West Bank here and affect Israeli politics, we say, sit down and shut up. This is our business, not yours. That's what we did, and we lied to them. We lied to them repeatedly. We told them that we would never put Kurdish forces west of the Euphrates, and we did. And then when they said, you promised not to do that, they said, yeah, well, that was yesterday. This is today. We gave them heavy weaponry. We said, oh, well, we're gonna take it all back afterwards. Now we're basically saying to them, you believe that promise? How could you believe that? That was a stupid thing for you to believe us. So, you know, this was so unwise from the beginning. Because the United States is the only power in the region, that put defeating ISIS as its strategic priority. Everybody else in the region sensibly said, what's the political order that's going to follow the defeat of ISIS? And what did we say, basically? We didn't say it, but we showed it very clearly. Iranian-Russian domination. That's what we offered. So any problems we've got in that region right now are ours, not the Turks. Sorry.
Thanks, Jomana. That was a clear answer, Mike, on citizenship, and I might add to that, say, but if everybody does that, then we end up with thousands of people without citizenship of anywhere that are stranded in Syria.
Sure. No, actually, my understanding of American law, and we can probably take this offline and just to be sure, but my cursory sort of research showed that actually, if you are a naturalized citizen, that your citizenship can be revoked, not your birthright citizenship. So if you were born in the United States on this soil, the way citizenship can be revoked is actually different. And if you are a naturalized citizen, within 5 years of obtaining your citizenship, if you are a member of, I think it's a communist party or terrorist organization, you can have that revoked. I saw that on the USCIS. I was actually looking at this with other colleagues at the law school. So this is something that I didn't go into deep delve, but my understanding is that birthright is handled differently than naturalization, which is why, what's her name, Muthanna, the American Huda, which is why her citizenship, the issue of her citizenship is at risk. But the other ISIS fighters, to my understanding, that were born in the United States will be prosecuted as Americans for terrorism, not as non-Americans. So.
Okay, next we have the gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Mushtaba from Free Muslim Center for Extremism Prevention. 2 questions, one for Bassam on the accountability. Is identifying the mentality of ISIS fighters and their ideology the way to go, as opposed to what geography, region were they from? So most of them were Wahhabi extremists. So is it identifying it's the Wahhabi extremism that we need to fight as Syrians, as opposed to are they Jordanian or from Saudi, or are they from Iran, or are they from elsewhere? Is it the mentality that we need to tackle, as opposed to where they're from? And on rebuilding Syria for Jomana is, I believe after Holocaust tragedy, Germany paid a huge lump sum of money just for it being the country that the tragedy happened in. So is identifying what nationality these foreign fighters had and holding their countries accountable for some of the money that they have to pay as a penalty, a way to go forward. For example, so if they're from a such and such country, those foreign fighters, is it saying that, hey, country, you let them come and fight here and kill people, so now you have to pay some lump sum as a penalty, like Germany did, I think.
Thanks. Two very good questions. Bassam, do you want to start off?
Yes. No, our challenge is not with the nationality, but rather with the mindset. We are not against any religion in Syria, but we want to make sure that a new Syria will have a room for everybody, and that there is no extremism that is that undermines a democratic Syria. This is what we mean by confronting the ideology.
And to be honest, this is the first time I hear of your suggestion, so I don't really have any thoughts. It's interesting. I highly doubt that it's. I mean, I can't see the international community being enthusiastic about this idea. 110 countries had fighters go to Syria, but it's an interesting one. I'll just leave it at that.
Jonas is going to offer an isolated Danish island. It'll become the new Guantanamo.
I think, yeah.
Guantanamo North.
I was about to say you guys have tried that before. I think it was called something, but yeah. Okay, we have a question down here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. Just as a point of order, any child born of a diplomat is not a citizen. They are on the so-called blue list. That doesn't apply to military guys who are going to school in somewhere in the U.S., but it does apply just to diplomats. My question is, I hate magical thinking. It's my #1 enemy. And anybody that thinks there's going to be peace in Syria with a minority government is just whistling Dixie. I mean, this is absurd. There's no peace with the minority government. So could we take a page from the Afghans and get 200 countries behind a lawyer Jerga to bring all these elements together into one huge circus tent and let them argue for 12 days and come out with some solution that might make sense?
Could I just address the first question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what I had said when I spoke about Huda's case is her father resigned from his diplomatic post in June of, I think, 94 when she was born. Excuse me, he resigned in June and she was born in October. So now the debate, the legal debate.
And he's an illegal immigrant.
Well, he was here. I mean, that's obviously why this is being litigated. But the whole issue is he was not an acting diplomat at the time. I'm not here to be a defense lawyer for her. I'm not working on the case, but I'm just pointing out what the legal question is whether he was here legally during that time period and she was born here. Does that entitle her to birthright citizenship if he is not a working diplomat at the time? That's the legal question in this case. And I think the courts will decide.
Bassam, the question of a lawyer Jirka, who would survive being in a tent with Assad for 12 days and what will come out of it?
Oh, God, that'd be horrible.
Now, let me just address about the majority-minority, because this is at the heart of the Syrian conflict. Right now, it's no peace, obviously, with the Assad regime. You know, what we have had, although it survived for from 1971, Assad was in power till things broke out in 2011. But eventually, it was destruction. So this is not the right solution. But we need solutions in Syria for everybody because it's a very diverse country. Has many groups, and you need a healthy solutions for the minorities in Syria, whether they are ethnic, religious, or political minorities. This is very important for us as Syrians. We're not saying we want to rule Syria as a small group. What we are saying is we need a better solution for the diversity of Syria. And this is what we have thought about in SDC. And what we have come up with is a decentralized Syria where everybody can have a piece of the cake. What we have in Syria, we had in Syria, and what Turkey proposes for Syria, and Iran, for that matter, and Russia, is basically this vicious cycle. It's either I rule or you rule. One of us is going to rule. One would be the rulers, the others will be the subjects. What we are proposing in SDC is, let us find a way that we can all have a piece of the cake, we can all rule. And this is what is our voice. It is not a voice about how much correct or incorrect to align with Turkey or with Russia or with Iran. We are a local indigenous voice that is trying to find a solution for this diversity that we have in Syria. What is going to be the common identity that we can all have and be an umbrella for all of us so we could have peace? That's what we're trying to propose.
Thank you. I have a question here.
My name is Bassam Ishak. I like the idea of decentralization, and I like the idea of putting the boot on Assad's neck and perhaps on Erdogan's neck as well. Why don't we strive for some kind of Iraqi solution with some kind of an SDF autonomy and perhaps maybe Alawite autonomy and a Druze autonomy, some kind of a confederation? Maybe this is the only stable solution.
Who wants to start with more of a confederation?
I guess I'm stuck with it.
You.
It's our favorite subject, at SDC, decentralization. Yes, we look very hardly at the Iraqi model when we're trying to learn from the Iraqi model. And I think some of the lessons we have learned is we don't want just a federation for one ethnic group in the name of an ethnic group in Syria, like what happened in Iraq. It may be good in Iraq to have it because you have the geopolitics that justifies it for the Kurds in Iraq. You don't have it in northern Syria. You have a mixture of Arabs, Turkmenis, Kurds, Syriacs, Assyrians, Chechens, and many others. So I think our project is more self-administrations, and we want whatever is the system to be negotiated among Syrians because they are going to live through it. Right now, it's not being negotiated among Syrians. Like, take for example the Constitution Committee. The members of the Constitution Committees don't represent Syrian political groups or Syrian ethnicities, or they represent who Turkey wants and put on the table, who the Assad regime in Russia wants and put at the table, and who they don't want, we were out of the table in our case. So we think Syrians should be given the space by all these powers who are jockeying for grabbing Syria. We need to be given the space to negotiate among ourselves this decentralized system, and it shouldn't be just for one geographical area and for one ethnic group. We want it to be for all Syrians so that they are empowered, and this will be a great way to make sure that we won't have a next dictator in Syria. In the name of democracy, it'll be even worse.
Mike, I could sense you had something to add to this.
Just that I'm very sympathetic to Bassam's point of view, but I don't see how it can be achieved. I mean, at one point, that would have been my preferred solution when I thought that there were going to be sufficient American troops so that America could hold the ring and then promote that kind of dialogue inside whatever area it was controlling. But in the absence of force on the ground, it becomes a question of negotiating with these other powers, which takes me back to everything I said about Turkey. I have hopes that if the negotiations with the Turks are handled correctly, some of Bassam's aspirations can be achieved. But that's where the game is now, I believe.
Thanks, Mike. We'll take two more questions over here, and then we'll sort of try to round up. So this gentleman and the gentleman behind, let's just take both of you in one round, and then we can address those questions and also have sort of final remarks from up here. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Kelly from Bluemont International, formerly International Relief and Development. My question pertains to Jomana's comment that probably the last area that we do hold leverage is the reconstruction monies, and Mike's comment that we need to work through Turkey as they are our most effective ally in the region, and that most of that funding should probably flow through Northeast Syria. But we do have a lot of competing priorities here. Is there a way to reconcile all of those priorities?
Thanks. And the gentleman behind?
Yes, Benjamin Sutherland, reporter with The Economist. This is a question for Bassam. You mentioned 100, or I think 109 assassinations. Were these essentially ISIS fighters who had melted away, went back into the population, and are engaging in violence, perhaps under the threshold of what might be considered a terror attack, to settle scores or continue jihad by some other means? Is that what was going on?
Well, most of the assassinations targeted leaders within local councils, people who were key in carrying out this model. So it was undermining the model. This is what was and it's not necessarily ISIS. We have many enemies, you know, who don't want to see this model succeed, and who have the wrong negative propaganda against our model. And this is one of the ways that they have been fighting us. So I don't want to just point without a proof just to ISIS, although they are one of the groups.
Jomana, turn to you and both answer the question and any sort of concluding remarks you'd like to offer.
Sure. I think it is going to be a challenge to balance all of our priorities. It's not, I mean, that's obviously why the international community hasn't solved this problem yet, and it's gone on like 2 months since sort of the American withdrawal and sort of lurching us into the next phase of the Syrian conflict. I think as someone who has followed the humanitarian crisis incredibly closely for the last 8 years, I don't want to see further death and destruction and real, punishment of the average Syrian person in Syria. That remains, and I think that should always remain in the back of our minds in any policy decision we're making. At the same time, this may be the last opportunity we have to impact the future actions of someone like Bashar al-Assad, who, like I said, could be in power for a very long time. I mean, there's no telling exactly, you know, what things will happen in the future, how elections or any of these things may play out, if they even occur. And so we have an obligation to try to extract as many concessions, but doing that, like I said, being mindful at the same time of the people, because we also don't want, we want to punish, but we want to also make sure that those sanctions don't fuel hatred of a future Syrian generation against the international community. So it's really a delicate balance that I don't have an answer to. I really sympathize with what Mike said, and it's not something I don't disagree with. But I am trying to balance, sort of trying to keep our humanity in terms of sort of the underlying factor, but also to carry a big stick to ensure, like, how do you ensure accountability and justice in the region and stability? It's not an easy task.
Thanks, Jomana. Mike, do you want to offer your, or Bassam as well, you answered the question, but if you have any concluding remarks you want to add?
No, yeah.
I don't have a good answer to the question because it's I mean, that is the tough question. Is there's no clear path forward. I just would end up repeating myself. I guess I will repeat myself because I think I think that the United States has, since 9/11, become strategically stupid. We let the violence of a relatively small number of nasty men let us forget the essence of international relations, which is the relations between states. And so we started to find out we're fighting an ideology, we're fighting terrorists, and we had counter-ISIS became the #1 thing, and counter-ISIS was the vehicle by which the Iranians and the Russians took all of this took all this power. So we have to go back to basics, and basics are allies, states, balance of power, and then all of the other questions, which I agree with my colleagues about humanitarian concerns and everything else. All of those others should be dealt with within the framework of allies and enemies.
So there you got your grand strategy and realism to end from Mike Doran. Thanks a lot. I would say thanks to the audience for being really active with us today and great questions. And then join me in thanking all our panelists here for being here today and for providing their insights.
You have to. Oh, I mean, you have to forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
You and I know each other.
Right. I have even the emails. I know.
What do you
and you didn't remember me.
No, it's, I tell you what, before I have a counter-revolutionary movement. I have a